Cecilia is going to give us insight with regards to mining and community agreements, which I think builds beautifully on the last few talks that we've had today. So Cecilia, over to your wonderful self. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the organizers for giving me this opportunity to participate in the sharing of experiences and learnings. I hope you see my slides very clearly, and I see Ludwig nodding, so I take it from there. And actually, it is a very good session, I think, following Kyle's, because I noted something he said about impact benefit agreements, and I completely agree that just an agreement on paper is worthless, and an impact benefit agreement or a community agreement, which I'll be talking about, is only as good as the partnership that it represents. So with that, I want to do a little bit of introduction for those of you who don't know our organization. It's Sustainable Development Strategies Group. I am a co-founder, and together with Luke Danielson, who quite a while back headed the Mining, Minerals, and Sustainable Development Project. That's where our association began when I was the Southeast Asia consultant for that project. I am a dual licensed attorney bilocated in Colorado in the Philippines. So I'm in Denver right now, but next week I'll be back in Manila. And SDSG, our acronym, is a Denver-based nonprofit. And some of the work we do, just to provide we work on sustainability issues, especially in policy and law reform, but also in managing projects. We've been a validator for the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, beginning with Guatemala, and later on for 14 other countries. We've done a lot of work on community agreements and mining. As you'll see here, I worked on community agreements, and especially the potential that maybe social impact investments can present for strengthening this area of complicated engagement. We've worked across different regions. And so I'm very happy to be here, but my talk will focus specifically on community agreements and as they relate to mining specifically. I did want to say also that my more recent work has involved mainly energy and natural resources, renewable energy, particularly rooftop solar projects in the Philippines and Vietnam, and supporting sustainable forestry management in Malaysia as well, under a Singapore-based company. Anyway, my focus, as I said, I will bring back first and recall almost 30 years ago in the Philippines, where everything began for me, of course. And the Mining Act of the Philippines was instituted in 1995, so almost 30 years ago. And it was hailed by quite a number of parties, especially government and industry, as very progressive, which it was and is in many respects. It integrated for the first time social and environmental provisions that had before then not been in existence. And more dramatically, it actually integrated a requirement for the prior consent of indigenous communities with respect to mining projects, which again, pretty much was unheard of at the time in terms of legislation. And then it went on to require a royalty payment for indigenous communities that were affected. Either they occupied or owned, they had ancestral title to these lands. That provided the foundation or the framework for community agreements, because later on, very soon after, in implementing regulations and further laws, it was required that there would be agreements with communities with respect to mining. Just a quick side note that 2 years later, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act extended that to all major development and resource-based projects with respect to indigenous peoples. And that's why there is a lot of history there, but also a lot of challenges. Going back to the Mining Act of 1995, the year later, though, the largest disaster in mining happened in the Philippines, which was the Gamar copper mining disaster, where we saw 1.6 million cubic meters of tailings spill into a large river system, affecting at least 5 villages, over 20,000 people. One of those villages completely submerged, and the community fortunately was able to relocate, but not. Clearly we can see pictures and read about it, but it's the scope of such accidents and incidents and it's unimaginable, the scope. And this is not unique. As the previous speaker said, the reputation of mining in many places across the world is, and to use the word here, quite disastrous. And it's how do you build trust, especially with those directly affected, especially when the impacts and benefits are so disproportionately felt. And that has been largely the history in many places and for many local communities across the world. So in the last 20 or 30 years, or last 2 or 3 decades, there's been a growing emphasis or focus on, okay, what is the role of the community? Where long ago, well, not long ago really, but even in recent history, they were not considered to be an actual party in a mining agreement, right? They did not have, as the cliche goes, a seat at the table, which is quite ironic since in many cases, it's their table. So what happened was, with this growing emphasis on communities, there was all this dialogue and discussion and thought that went into, well, is it engagement? Is it participation? Is it consultation? And then, of course, it evolved to, really consent, which is more and more the case, as previous speakers have alluded to, in many cases, in many contexts, that is what's required. So just a very simple amateur chart I quickly made here about, the need for stability is very important for many reasons, for the communities whose lives are directly impacted, for the nation who benefits economically and for sustainability purposes, for the government, and for the private sector that for the large part manages these projects. But the conflicts over impacts and benefits are generally what causes unrest, resistance, and in some unfortunate cases, in terrible situations like Grasberg, Porgera, etc., they cause actual violence and violent conflict. So again, I capture again this whole dialectic between or among participation, consultation, and consent, which often, especially now, more and more leads to actual agreements. That's what embodies the relationship on the ground. So more and more, this is a little bit dated, this slide, but more and more there are national frameworks that incorporate these requirements. And so they either require or strongly encourage. More and more they do so. And Philippines is only one example. You have Liberia, Mongolia, Sierra Leone, all of these countries more and more are requiring even engagement and actual agreements with local communities with respect to mining projects. And some of this, most of this, or all of it, will come from requirements with respect to benefit sharing. Mexico, at the end of April, passed the law requiring a 5% share of profits to local communities affected by mining. And the express policy provision there was because of the fact that communities affected by mining remain largely impoverished. And so again, that is the perverse or disproportionate impact that's felt there. And the whole issue of trust, how do you build trust with this history, with these challenges? That is what we are trying to focus on. And I think collaboratively, we all are, as we engage in these discussions. So what are some of these challenges? There are too many to discuss here that I present that have been the subject of a lot of our analysis. I would like to focus on a few of them because some were also brought up by prior speakers. For example, time constraints. I think Mark, if I'm not mistaken, brought up the issue of how building trust is a necessarily slow process. I mean, whether it's on a personal level or on a transactional level, it is not instant. It's not, it just takes time. But that goes smack against the timetable of governments, of investors, in terms of project finance. So how do you build trust at the community level when you have this external framework that requires you to meet particular deadlines? Okay, and so that is a struggle that is an issue we are struggling with. And then you have important issues about the exclusion of women and particular other sectors, especially when you come across customary rules in many cases. That's something that also has to be dealt with. And then you have the dominant participation of local elites, which gives rise. So not only are we dealing with national level risks and loopholes where corruption can come in, but also at the local level, you have the potential for elite capture when there is lack of representation or lack of adequate representation or even appropriate representation of the parties who should be there. And then finally, lack of transparency, which leads to my topic to really the heart of the topic, which is community agreements are largely, by and large, still shrouded in secrecy almost. So there's a lack of transparency with them and the negotiation processes, how they're implemented, how effective they are, and the like. And so our work has focused a lot on trying to shed light. Okay, and why is this important? We believe that the more communities and their advisors and advocates learn about what other communities have done, are doing, plan to do, what has worked and why, what hasn't worked and why not, that these will be very important drivers for, for capacity building, for improving negotiation skills, for improving substantive aspects of the relationship between companies, communities, or governments, depending on the legal framework and who is engaged in a community development agreement. So I point to this one here because SDSG has worked with IIED, Institute for Environment and Development, International Institute for Environment and Development, and other partners on building a database of community agreements, what's available out there. And there are other similar efforts to do so, whether they are toolkits, guidebooks, repositories. So there is a growing amount of literature out there, but again, I will reiterate, by and large, a lot of community development agreements are kept non-transparent. And in many cases, we have found by the communities themselves. In many cases, the companies, in some cases, the governments, but again, in our experience, we have encountered both in our workshops, for example, with representatives from Indonesia, from PNG, from the Philippines, and I understand from Canada as well. It's a lot of communities themselves are resistant to the publicity or the publication of their agreements. And it's important for us to understand why, from whosever perspective, it's important for them to keep these non-transparent. But we believe that making them more transparent, kind of aligning with mining agreements and how before there was also mainly secrecy about them, and EITI and other initiatives have basically taken, blown the lid off much of that in terms of international principles and standards. We believe that analogously, this will help communities if these are much more transparent. So we part of what we're trying to do is build on the work already that's been done, that we in SDSG and others have done, and try to capture, in actual virtual accessible tools, a lot of this data and make them, as I said, practical and accessible for the ones who need them the most, which are communities dealing with governments and mining companies. And how to do that will be a big challenge because there are these databases, but how do we ensure that they can be in the hands of people who need them the most is basically the challenge. So we would like to, our SDSG is working in the context of particular initiatives to try and make this more of a reality. And that will not only include a static database or platform, but hopefully incorporate tools as well for then monitoring and evaluating whether a CDA actually does what it's supposed to do. I have gotten the question recently about whether my emphasis on the lack of transparency and challenges, whether that means that CDAs are not a good idea. And I said, far from that. That's not my intent. My intent is precisely, or our intention is precisely to say that the goal of CDAs is a positive, good one. It is something in the right direction. But the fact that, but how to ensure that they are actually a tool and not an end in themselves, but a tool to ensure sustainable outcomes, that is the challenge. And so that is what we must work toward. So to end, if I may, again, going around the positives, which I don't have to read specifically, but community agreements, they demonstrate recognition and respect for the rights of communities and their interests. In some cases, many communities do not have legal rights, but I think their interests must be understood and they're respected. And then they incorporate CDAs. So by CDA, community development agreements, or alternatively impact benefit agreements, or just generally community agreements. They facilitate socioeconomic benefits such as livelihoods, provide capacity building opportunities, facilitate consultations, and for governments and for the greater interest economically, especially, they help assure project stability. And this is really important, especially in the context of the energy transition that's needed. That it's important to ensure or to help ensure the stability of mining projects. And as we wrote in one of our reports, in an effectively negotiated, implemented, and monitored community development agreements, communities would neither be victims to external decisions nor passive recipients of benefits. They would be equal partners in a relationship of trust. And there's been a very, very helpful and insightful discussions this afternoon about and the days prior on trust and the complexities of trust. And even at the very least, trust on a transactional level, that I do what I'm expected to do and you do what you are expected to do in our agreement, and that we also have a respected agreement about what we do. If the problems arise, that framework of trust is I believe at the very least enough to hopefully help ensure more sustainability in the outcomes of a mining project. Thank you very much.
Cecilia, thank you so much for that. Everybody, round of applause for the wonderful Cecilia. Absolutely fantastic. And I really love what you're pulling together here in terms of sharing all of that practice from around the world, because certainly people always ask me, they say, where can I see another version of something, and compare and contrast, like what are we looking at? And it's a really nice way of not saying something is good or bad. It just allows people to compare and contrast. Is that a correct interpretation?
Absolutely, yes. However, analytically, there would be things that after evaluating would not be good or even bad. I mean, certain things, right? And there are practices that would be better or even best. I mean, there was a previous speaker that talked about, you mentioned a prior session that talked about community banks in Burkina Faso, and then larger examples of community trust agreements and how these are handled, and the financial literacy skills that are required by all parties concerned. So to take those experiences and learn from them, and so communities themselves, they're advocates again, they're advisors, and can help improve and strengthen the whole process and represent more meaningfully.
Brilliant. I think if I may, Cecilia, I'm going to invite Catherine, who I know she was there 2 seconds ago, but she's just turned off her camera, because I suspect that Catherine's been involved in a number of community agreements in her time. Catherine, what's your perspective on community agreements?
I agree with a lot of what Cecilia said. I think that token dagger approach has been the downfall of a lot of them. And it echoes back to what Kyle was saying as well, and that video about having the agreement in your pocket, saying, you give up everything if I give you this, and I'll give you some beads. And I think for the mining sector in particular's misfortune, it still adopts and not all, but there is a general perception of, and the guys that do it right don't ever tell anyone, and they just wait to I think the mining sector spends less on promotion than the alcohol sector. I think like 100th of the amount the alcohol sector spends on promotion of what it does and when it does things well. And I think it's still predominantly, it seems to be dominated by very much a neo-colonial sort of attitude that they know better than the communities, and they need to do things to help these people, because what do these people know? And you just hear it again and again and again. And I think things like the transparency initiatives that Cecilia is talking about, as well as some of the other speakers have been mentioning about the fact that First Nations, and that you're going to have to treat them as equals. God, hell, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? They're people. I'm quite cynical about it all, but I just think until host communities are really regarded as equals, and as host communities, and you are the unwanted guests at the party quite often as a mining company or an exploration company, I think I don't see how it can change. So I think transparency is so important, but also dialogue and an acknowledgement. And just drop the neo-colonial. Let's be a post-colonial industry instead.
Thanks, Catherine. Cecilia, what do you think with regards to Catherine's overview there?
Well, the cynicism is understandable. A certain extent of it, I can't imagine that one wouldn't be after, especially when one has worked on a lot of projects where, again, to repeat myself, you see the not just disproportionate, but really perversely disproportionate impact that communities have felt in a number of mining projects versus the benefits. And so I agree, there's a lot of work to be done. Transparency is one door maybe to opening up, the potential of more meaningful and actual and genuine engagement at that level. And I agree fundamentally with what she said about regarding everyone as equals. It's very easy to say, but there are certain attitudes that are so ingrained that it's very hard to change. It's almost, but we've been saying this for decades. So we have to keep working at it. In a certain sense, there is, of course, a superiority, quote unquote, of information on the technical side. But then there is, however, a superiority in terms of knowledge of local, there's indigenous knowledge that should not be disregarded. That's very important also. And culturally, if that is not recognized, that's what leads precisely to conflict, and at the very least, unrest, resistance, and most importantly, just the lack of improvement in people's lives. And so that, which is not supposed to not be the goal.
Ron, I'm sure you've got something to say with regards to this. What do you reckon?
And I think these dialogues are good, but I think, most of the people I work with in Alaska in the mining industry and in Canada and throughout North America are good folks and, want to do things that are good for communities. And, I've seen a lot of examples of this in terms of the work of people that take great pride in that work. Perhaps someone said we don't do a good job of selling ourselves sometimes and advertising that. Some of there's a lot of different reasons for that. Mining companies aren't necessarily as savvy and don't necessarily always have the same resources as other companies that are much bigger than ours. I don't hear the Nikes or the Apples of the world condemned at the same level in terms of doing stuff. But I think my suggestion is give some of these companies a chance and really engage in the dialogue rather than walking in with the perception sometimes that, they're, again, just having spent 2 days in the middle of Western Alaska, sitting and talking to people about their families and their communities and really engaging in a lot of good discussion. I think give some folks a chance. I mean, I think certainly there are people in our industry, like every other industry, that don't do a very good job in that aspect of it. But I do think the industry is trying. And I think sometimes, and we have to deal with it. Some of the rhetoric associated with it is damaging. And, it's just my feeling towards it because it's something I'm very passionate about as part of it. And again, I don't underestimate the challenge associated with it, but I do think there are people willing to sit and listen and talk about and be involved in bringing benefits to communities and that aspect of it as part of this, and that we have made a lot of progress, far longer to go. And I keep getting at this concept, which seems to get lost in a lot of these discussions. Everything that's out there, if we don't, I heard a comment made in a meeting in Colorado by very smart gentleman from academia, that this time was a great opportunity for the mining industry and great responsibility. Well, the data right now says if the mining industry fails, we're never, at least unless something changes, and certainly we support technologies and new innovation and other stuff that ultimately could reduce mineral demand. frankly, society is going to fail on this issue of climate change. If we don't find a way to work together, and the people that, frankly, where I work, that be hit hardest by it are the people that are, in many cases, the most disadvantaged folks in the world. So I guess that's my plea to folks, is give some of us a chance rather than, I know perceptions are hard to overcome in a lot of different places, but at least the people I work with want to do good things. And we spend a lot of time in those communities and places where, trying to bring, I think, things that are beneficial across the board in a sustainable manner.